The kingdom of Zola was a land of sunlight and song, a place where the wind carried the rhythm of drums and the laughter of children echoed across golden plains. Every morning, the palace gates opened to the voices of merchants, dancers, and farmers who came to greet their beloved ruler, King Zola. He was not just a king by crown, but a father to his people, kind, strong, and deeply proud of his heritage. His golden crown, placed upon a polished wooden stand every night, was more than a royal ornament. It was the soul of Zola itself. The old ones used to say, "As long as the crown shines, the kingdom will never fall." The crown's golden light had seen the rise of generations, battles fought, and peace restored. And every time King Zola looked upon it, he saw not just metal, but the reflection of his people's trust. Among the nobles of his court stood Lord Kanu, a man of grace and wealth but burdened by envy. He had served beside the king for many years, but each passing day deepened the bitterness in his heart. He watched how the king was loved by all, how every villager bowed with joy at the mention of his name, and how every noble sought his favor. Kanu's pride whispered to him, "You are no less worthy. Why does the sun never shine on you?" His chambers were filled with riches, fine robes, silver plates, and jewels from across the lands, but none of it soothed the fire of jealousy burning within. Each time King Zola smiled at another man's loyalty, Kanu's chest tightened with resentment. The poison of envy is silent. It hides behind polite smiles, behind empty laughter, behind the clinking of wine cups at royal banquets. Tariq, a young servant in the palace, was far removed from the games of power. Barefoot, simple, and quiet, he spent his days sweeping marble corridors and carrying water for the kitchens. But though his clothes were old and his duties small, his eyes carried a strange peace. He loved his work, not because it brought him wealth, but because he believed every act done with honesty was seen by the heavens. While nobles boasted of their titles, Tariq whispered prayers as he cleaned the royal hall. Often, he would pause before the golden crown, gazing at its soft glow, as if it spoke to him in silence. He never dared touch it, but sometimes he smiled to himself and said softly, "Even gold needs care, just like hearts do." To most, he was invisible, a shadow moving between the feet of greatness. But fate, quiet and patient, was already watching him. As the sun set one evening, the palace glowed under the orange sky. Drums echoed in the courtyard as the king celebrated a bountiful harvest with his people. Laughter filled the air, yet somewhere in the shadows, Lord Kanu's eyes were fixed on the crown resting beside the king's throne. His thoughts twisted and darkened with every passing cheer. "They bow to him because of that golden thing," he murmured under his breath. "Take away the shine, and they'll see he's just a man." His heart pounded faster, not with courage, but with envy disguised as ambition. He raised his cup, smiling as he toasted the king, but behind his smile, a storm brewed, a storm that would soon shake the walls of Zola. As the night deepened and torches flickered in the wind, the crown's gentle glow danced across Kanu's restless eyes. And in that shimmer, jealousy found its purpose. That same night, when the laughter had faded and the drums had gone silent, the moon rose high above the kingdom of Zola, silvering the palace walls. The celebration was over, but in the grand hall, one man's thoughts refused to rest. Lord Kanu stood alone, his shadow stretching long across the stone floor. His eyes drifted toward the golden crown resting beside the throne, its glow faint but proud, the heart of the kingdom pulsing in the quiet. Every echo of his heartbeat whispered the same bitter truth: he could never be what King Zola was. His envy had become a voice now, hissing softly in his ear, "Break it! Let him feel what you feel!" Kanu hesitated, trembling, his fingers brushing the air as if reaching for forbidden fire. A drop of sweat slid down his temple. He could hear his own breathing, rough and uneven, in the empty hall. He looked around. No guards, no servants, no witnesses. The palace slept in peace, its faith resting in the golden symbol before him. Slowly, carefully, he walked toward the throne. His footsteps were soft, but his guilt was loud. As he approached the crown, his pulse roared like thunder. His reflection shimmered on the gold surface, warped and trembling. For a moment he saw not a noble, but a desperate man drowning in his own jealousy. "Why does he deserve everything?" he whispered, his voice breaking in the vast silence. His trembling hands reached out, and before his reason could stop him, his rage took command. The sound of cracking gold sliced through the night like a scream. He stared at what he had done. The crown lay split, a jagged wound across its once perfect shape. Horror seized him. His chest tightened, his breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp, and the soft flicker of flame revealed the broken truth at his feet. Panic set in. He wrapped the crown in a silk cloth, hiding the damage, and slipped away through the dark corridors like a ghost. When the sun rose, the kingdom woke to chaos. Guards ran through the palace, servants whispered in fear, and the king's angry voice echoed through the courtyard. "Who has done this?" he thundered, his hands clutching the pieces of the broken crown. His eyes, usually calm as still water, burned with disbelief. Queen Amara, standing beside him, touched his arm gently. "My king," she said softly, "it is only a crown. We can make another." But King Zola shook his head slowly. "You don't understand," he replied, voice heavy with sorrow. "This crown carries our faith. Its cracks are the cracks in our unity." He turned toward his nobles and declared, "Bring every goldsmith, every jeweler, every craftsman from across the lands. I will not rest until it shines again." The word spread fast. Messengers galloped through villages, calling upon artisans from far and wide. Within days, the palace was filled with hammers, chisels, and the scent of melting gold. One by one, the craftsmen presented their work. Each crown was beautiful, each shone brightly under the torchlight, but none carried the same warmth, the same soul as the original. The king would shake his head after every attempt, saying softly, "No, this is not mine." Lord Kanu watched from a distance, pretending to share the king's grief. But inside, guilt gnawed at him, hollowing him out. Every failed attempt was like a whisper of accusation. He tried to convince himself it was just an object, that the king would soon forget, but each passing day deepened his torment. Every night he dreamed of the sound, the sharp, piercing crack of gold breaking, and he would wake drenched in sweat. Still, he smiled in public, hiding behind his practiced grace, while his heart rotted beneath the mask. And among the busy palace corridors, while nobles argued and goldsmiths worked tirelessly, one figure moved silently through the chaos: Tariq, the humble servant. He watched from afar as the king stood beside the broken crown, his face shadowed with worry. The palace had changed. The joy had vanished, replaced by tension and fear. Tariq could feel it even in the air he breathed. One afternoon, as he mopped the floor near the royal hall, he whispered to himself, "So much noise, yet no peace." His gaze fell on the damaged crown, lying lifeless on the table, its cracks catching the light like scars. Something stirred within him, a quiet voice, not of pride, but of compassion. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. The crown wasn't just broken metal. It was a wounded heart waiting for someone to care. And as the palace buzzed with frustration, Tariq made a promise in silence. One day, he would try. He didn't know how, or when, but he believed that even broken things could shine again if touched with honesty. Outside, the evening drums began to echo once more, but this time, their rhythm felt heavier, like the heartbeat of a kingdom holding its breath. Days passed, but the wound in the heart of the kingdom only deepened. The broken crown lay beneath a silk cloth in the grand chamber, as if the entire palace were mourning in silence. The king spent hours gazing out of the window, his eyes empty and distant. Every knock on the door brought another failed attempt, another goldsmith bowing his head in defeat. Hope was vanishing like morning mist. Lord Kanu watched quietly from the edge of the hall, his guilt turning heavier each day. Every clang of a hammer struck his conscience, and yet he said nothing. But far from the court's despair, Tariq continued his simple duties, sweeping the corridors, polishing lamps, and whispering prayers under his breath. The palace servants gossiped endlessly about the broken crown, some even saying the gods had cursed it. Tariq, however, felt something different. Whenever he passed by the covered relic, A strange pull stirred inside him, a whisper in his heart that said, asterisk, perhaps it needs something no goldsmith can give. Asterisk. One evening, after all the artisans had gone, Tariq lingered near the hall. He could hear the king speaking softly to Queen Amara. It was my pride, he said, his voice trembling. Perhaps I loved the crown more than the people it represented. The queen's reply was tender yet wise. A king's heart is tested not when things shine, but when they shatter. The words struck Tariq deeply. He stood in the shadows, feeling something awaken in him, a courage he didn't know he had. As he walked back to his small room in the servants' quarters, he looked at his worn-out tools, a wooden mallet, a tiny hammer, and an old polishing cloth that once belonged to his father. They were useless in a royal forge, but filled with the memory of his father's voice teaching him, asterisk, anything done with a clean heart finds its own light. Asterisk. That night, as the palace slept, Tariq couldn't close his eyes. His mind kept returning to the crown, its cracks, and the sadness in the king's eyes. By morning, he had made his decision. When the king entered the court once again, tired and hopeless, Tariq stepped forward quietly, bowing deeply. His voice shook, but his eyes were firm. Your Majesty, he said, I am no goldsmith, but I wish to try. The court fell silent. For a moment there was disbelief, then laughter. Nobles exchanged amused glances. A servant? One whispered mockingly. He cannot even afford shoes. Another chuckled. The crown will turn to dust in his hands. But King Zola raised a hand, silencing them. His gaze met Tariq's, and in that simple stare, he saw something he had not seen in days: honesty. You, the king said softly, wish to repair what even masters could not. Tariq nodded slowly. Yes, my king. Just one night. Let me try, not with gold or skill, but with the only thing I have, faith. The king studied him for a long moment, then finally said, So be it. You have until sunrise. That evening, the palace grew quiet once again. Guards stood at their posts, torches flickered against the walls, and in the small workshop near the courtyard, Tariq sat alone with the broken crown before him. He uncovered it gently, as if lifting a sleeping child. The cracks gleamed faintly in the lamplight, sharp and uneven. He traced them with his fingertips and whispered, You were made to shine again. Then he began his work, not with haste or pride, but with care so deep it felt like prayer. He cleaned each piece with a soft cloth, mixed gold dust with oil, and used his old tools to press the fragments together. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his heart stayed steady. Hours passed. The night deepened. Every sound in the palace faded, except the faint rhythm of his hammer, slow, deliberate, and full of feeling. Sweat rolled down his brow, tears blurred his sight, yet he smiled, whispering words his mother once said. Even broken things can become beautiful when love holds them. Outside, the sky began to lighten. A quiet breeze slipped through the window, brushing against Tariq's face. The first ray of dawn fell upon the crown, and something extraordinary happened. The cracks shimmered like rivers of light. The gold seemed to glow from within, not with the brilliance of wealth, but with the warmth of life. Tariq stepped back, exhausted yet at peace. He didn't know if it was perfect or worthy, but to him, it looked alive again. The crown, once wounded, now reflected the morning sun as if reborn. He smiled faintly and whispered, It's not the gold that healed you, it's the truth. Then, before anyone awoke, he placed the crown gently on the king's table and left quietly to wash his hands, his heart calm. The palace still slept, unaware that in a small, humble workshop, a servant had just mended not only a crown, but the faith of an entire kingdom. The first light of dawn crept through the palace windows, soft and golden, as the scent of morning dew drifted in from the gardens. The kingdom still slept, unaware of the miracle that had quietly unfolded in the small workshop near the courtyard. King Zola, weary from nights of disappointment, entered the hall, his footsteps heavy with hopelessness. Queen Amara followed, her voice gentle. My king, perhaps today will bring rest to your heart. He gave no answer, only lifted the silk cloth from the table where the crown rested. What his eyes saw made him freeze in disbelief. The crown, once fractured and dull, now gleamed brighter than it ever had before. The cracks were no longer scars. They were veins of light, glimmering with warmth instead of cold perfection. For a long moment, there was only silence. The king's hand trembled as he touched it, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. Who did this?" he whispered. The guards looked at one another, unsure, until a young soldier stepped forward and said softly, "Your Majesty, it was the servant Tariq. He worked through the night." Word spread through the palace like fire. Nobles rushed in, their faces filled with disbelief. They surrounded the king, staring at the crown in awe. The torchlight danced upon it, and in every glint they saw something deeper, something human. King Zola called for Tariq at once. The young servant entered the hall quietly, his clothes simple, his hands still marked with soot. He bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have done what I could. I don't know if it's worthy." The king stepped closer, lifting the crown into the sunlight. "Tell me," he asked, voice trembling, "how did you do this? What trick, what craft did you use?" Tariq smiled gently, the corners of his lips trembling with humility. "I used no trick, my king. I did not change the gold. I only filled the cracks with care, honesty, and prayer. Perhaps the crown remembered what it meant to shine." The court stood in utter stillness. Even the nobles who once mocked him could not speak. For the first time, the king felt something he hadn't felt since the day the crown broke: peace. He placed the crown upon his head, and its glow touched his skin like sunlight on still water. The people outside began to cheer, unaware of the secret truth unfolding within those royal walls. Yet amid the joy, destiny prepared its next revelation. As the king admired the restored crown, a soldier stepped forward hesitantly, his expression torn between fear and duty. "My king," he began, bowing deeply, "forgive me, but I must speak the truth. I was guarding the hallway that night, the night the crown was broken." The room grew silent once more. King Zola's face darkened slightly, his gaze turning toward the trembling soldier. "Speak, soldier," he commanded. The man swallowed hard. "It was not the gods, nor an accident," he said. "I saw Lord Kanu in the hall, near the throne, when all others slept. I heard the sound of gold breaking." The words fell heavy in the air, like stones in a still pond. Gasps filled the chamber. Eyes turned toward Kanu. He froze, his face pale as ash. The king's expression shifted from disbelief to quiet fury. He removed the crown from his head and placed it on the table beside him. "Is this true, Kanu?" His voice was calm but cold as steel. Kanu's lips trembled. He fell to his knees. "My king," he cried, "forgive me. I was blinded by jealousy. I thought if I broke the crown, I could break your pride. But I was wrong. I only broke myself." Silence followed his confession. King Zola looked at him for a long time, the weight of betrayal and wisdom colliding in his heart. "You broke gold," he said softly, but he, pointing to Tariq, restored faith. The hall remained hushed as dawn's full light poured through the windows, illuminating three figures, one fallen by envy, one crowned by truth, and one humbled by grace. Kanu knelt on the cold marble floor, his voice breaking as he begged for mercy. The great hall echoed with his sobs, but the king said nothing. Even the torches seemed to quiet, their flames bending lower, as if listening. Tariq stood silently at the back, his hands folded, his face unreadable. He had seen what envy could do to men. It could burn kingdoms, poison hearts, and turn even nobles into beggars of forgiveness. The queen stepped forward, her voice steady yet kind. "My king," she said softly, "he has confessed his sin. Let justice be tempered with mercy." Her words hung between them like a bridge between fire and peace. King Zola looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Then he turned back to Kanu, whose head remained bowed. "Rise," the king commanded. Kanu hesitated, but obeyed. His face was streaked with tears. "You have broken more than gold," the king continued. "You broke trust, and that is a heavier crown to mend. Yet, I will not let anger rule this court as you once let it rule you. A murmur rippled through the nobles, some shocked, some relieved. You will not be executed, the king said, his voice echoing through the chamber. But you will live in exile. You will rebuild what you destroyed, not with gold, but with humility. You shall spend your years in the outer villages, serving the poor whose voices we have long ignored. The hall fell silent again, but this time it was not fear that filled the air, it was awe. The king had chosen a punishment not of death, but of redemption. Tariq's heart lifted slightly as he watched Kanu fall to his knees again, not in pride, but in gratitude. Thank you, my king, Kanu whispered, tears spilling onto the floor. I will not waste this mercy. The king nodded, and with a slow motion of his hand, he dismissed the guards. Take him, he said gently, and let the people know that the strength of a crown is not in how it shines, but in how it forgives. As Kanu was led away, the queen looked toward Tariq, her eyes warm with admiration. You have done more than repair gold, she said softly. You have mended the hearts of men. Tariq bowed deeply, unsure what to say. For the first time in his life, he felt that his hands, rough, scarred, and often unseen, had truly built something eternal. Later that evening, the palace courtyard glowed under the soft hues of twilight. The air carried a new kind of peace. Servants spoke with laughter instead of fear, and the nobles, once arrogant, now greeted each other with humility. King Zola and Queen Amara stood at the balcony overlooking the courtyard, watching the people below. The crown shines differently now, the queen said quietly. It feels alive. The king smiled faintly. Perhaps because it carries the marks of imperfection, he replied. Like us. They turned their gaze toward Tariq, who stood near the fountain, polishing the palace lanterns as he always did. Though his task was simple, his presence now carried a quiet reverence. The king watched him for a moment longer before saying, The time has come to lift him higher. The next morning, the sound of the royal drums echoed across the courtyard. The people gathered, their faces glowing with curiosity. Banners waved in the sunlight, and even the birds seemed to join the song of renewal. When Tariq was summoned, he walked hesitantly toward the steps of the palace, unaware of what awaited him. The king stood before the crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. This servant, he declared, has taught us all that worth is not born from blood, but from virtue. When gold failed, his heart shone brighter. When envy destroyed, his kindness restored. From this day forward, Tariq shall no longer serve as a common hand, but as the keeper of the crown. Gasps filled the air. Some nobles bowed their heads in shame, others clapped softly. The queen smiled proudly, her eyes glistening with quiet joy. Tariq froze where he stood, his breath caught in disbelief. My king, he said, stepping forward, I am not worthy of such an honor. King Zola placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. That is precisely why you are. The words struck deeper than any metal could. As the crowd erupted in applause, Tariq bowed deeply, tears glimmering in his eyes. The king turned to the people. Let this be remembered, he proclaimed. A servant's hands may shape more than stone or gold, they may shape destiny itself. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing across the walls that once held only silence. Days turned to weeks, and the palace began to transform. Tariq's influence brought change, not through authority, but through humility. He restored old rooms, reopened kitchens for the hungry, and repaired the worn statues of forgotten heroes. Even the nobles began to follow his example, working alongside servants, their pride slowly softening. One evening, as the sun dipped low, King Zola visited Tariq in his workshop, the same place where the crown had been healed. You've done more than I ever could, the king said quietly. Tariq shook his head. No, my king. You taught me that even broken things can be made whole. I only followed that truth. The king smiled, his eyes soft. And that, he said, is what makes you greater than most kings. But not all stories end in light. Beyond the palace, far in the outer villages, Kanu's exile had begun. The man who once lived in silks now wore the clothes of a farmer. He worked under the sun, hands bleeding from the weight of the soil. Yet each night, when he rested, he would look up at the stars and whisper a prayer of thanks. "The king spared me," he would say softly. "Now I will learn what it means to be worthy." Over time, he began teaching children to read, helping rebuild homes, and sharing the story of his fall. The people grew to respect him, not as a lord, but as a man who had faced his own darkness and chosen to rise. Years later, when age had touched them all, the kingdom still spoke of the night the crown was broken and reborn. In the great hall, the crown sat upon its velvet throne, not perfect, but more beautiful for its scars. And beside it hung a single inscription, carved in gold, asterisk. "He who mends what envy breaks shall wear no crown of gold, but one of honor." Asterisk. Tariq would often pass by it quietly, smiling to himself. He never saw himself as a hero, only as someone who refused to let something precious stay broken. And so, the story of the servant who healed the broken crown became legend, not because it was filled with war or dragons, but because it spoke of something rarer: the courage to forgive, the strength to serve, and the grace to rebuild. Generations later, children still whispered his name when they spoke of hope. For every time a heart broke, someone would remember Tariq, and believe, once again, that even shattered gold can shine.